If you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. When the channel reaches 1,000 subscribers, I'll share a surprise story I've prepared especially for you. The dirt road leading to the fortress was lined with dry grass, the kind that bent easily in a late summer wind. Dust clung to the young woman's sandals and rose in faint clouds with every step she took. Her pace was slow, her legs aching from walking too far without food, yet she forced herself onward. She had no other direction to go. Her name was Livia, the daughter of a minor landholder in a nearby village. Her father had died the previous winter, and the stepmother he left behind treated her not as family, but as an unwanted burden. Within weeks of his burial, Livia was pushed out of her home with little more than the clothes on her back. She had no brothers, no cousins willing to shelter her. In the eyes of the village, she had become a mouth to feed without offering anything in return. As she approached the Roman outpost, her stomach tightened. She had seen legionaries from a distance before, men in heavy armor, trained to fight, feared by those who lived under the empire's rule. To stand near them now was something else entirely. The walls themselves looked taller than she remembered, built of stone that carried the marks of repairs from years of raids. Soldiers moved along the ramparts above, their shields glinting in the sun. She slowed her steps, her mind racing. If she begged for help, would they laugh? Would they turn her away? Or worse, treat her as someone to be used and discarded? The thought made her hands tremble, but she pressed forward. The memory of her stepmother's cold words, "You are no longer my concern," was stronger than her fear. It was not one of the gate guards who first noticed her, but a soldier patrolling the lower path near the watchtower. He moved with the measured steps of discipline, armor fitted neatly over his broad frame, helmet held under his arm. His face was weathered, with a thin scar running from his temple to his jawline. He was older than the young recruits who shouted and laughed during training. His eyes scanned her carefully, not with eagerness, but with the kind of caution born from years of duty. His name was Marcus. He had served nearly 15 years in the legions, sent to campaigns in Germania, and later to this quiet province where raids from across the border still kept the soldiers wary. His duty was simple yet constant: guard the walls, train the younger men, keep order inside and outside the fort. For Marcus, speaking little was not a choice, but a habit formed after losing too many comrades in places where words had offered no protection. Livia's breath caught when his gaze settled on her. His silence pressed heavier than words could have. She lowered her eyes, trying to steady her voice before it broke. "Please," she said, her throat dry. "I have nowhere to go." She hesitated, then forced the rest out, her fear plain in her expression. "If you'll give me shelter, I will obey. I ask only for safety." For a long moment, Marcus did not reply. His eyes held hers briefly, then shifted past her to the empty road. Livia's chest tightened, shame burning in her face, but she did not move. Her choice was clear. She could either turn back to the streets and risk hunger and danger, or stand here and place her fate in this man's silence. He finally stepped aside, a small gesture of his hand motioning her to follow. Livia's knees felt weak with relief, though she kept her head bowed. As she passed through the narrow gate into the fortress, the weight of what she had done settled over her. She had tied her survival to a man she did not know, a soldier whose life was built on discipline and secrecy. Whether this would save her or destroy her, she had no way of knowing. Inside the fortress walls, the air felt different. The smell of iron, oiled leather, and smoke from the barracks fires hung heavy. Livia walked closely behind Marcus, her eyes fixed on the ground, though she could not help but notice the order around her. Soldiers moved with purpose. Some carried buckets of water, others sharpened weapons, a few trained in the yard with wooden swords. She expected laughter or crude remarks at her presence, but most only glanced and returned to their tasks. The discipline she saw reminded her that this was not a place where she could behave freely. Every man here had a duty, and she would need to understand her place if she wanted to remain. Marcus led her to a narrow side passage that opened into a small chamber built of stone and timber. It was not richly furnished, only a wooden cot pushed against the wall, a clay lamp on a shelf, and a table with a jug of water and bread resting on it. She realized quickly this must have been his own quarters, or at least a part of them. Her first thought was whether she would truly be safe here. Would this soldier demand something from her in return? She had heard stories whispered in her village of women taken advantage of when desperate, but Marcus gave no sign of such intent. He gestured to the table, speaking for the first time in a quiet, steady tone. Eat. His voice was not harsh, but it carried the command of someone used to being obeyed. Livia obeyed without question, tearing small pieces from the bread and chewing slowly to calm her hunger. Her hands shook at first, not from weakness alone, but from the tension of being watched. Marcus stood near the door, his eyes moving between her and the yard outside. She wondered what he thought of her. Another burden, an intruder, or simply a villager who had forced herself into his life. As the silence stretched, her thoughts ran back to the night she left her home. Why had her stepmother not shown the smallest pity? Was it fear of poverty or simply cruelty? Livia could not know, but she felt the sting of abandonment as sharply now as she had then. She glanced at Marcus again. He seemed unmoved, his face calm, but his scarred features suggested he knew what it was to lose more than once. She thought of asking his name, but kept quiet, afraid her voice might break the fragile balance between them. The hours passed. When evening came, Marcus lit the small lamp, filling the room with a soft glow. He set down a folded cloak on the cot and then moved to the other side of the room where his own bedding lay, nothing more than a blanket rolled against the wall. Livia hesitated, unsure if she should speak, but the weight of gratitude pressed against her chest. "Thank you," she whispered, almost certain he would not answer. To her surprise, he gave the faintest nod. That night, sleep did not come easily. Livia lay awake on the cot, staring at the ceiling beams, her heart racing with thoughts she could not silence. She worried about the rules here. What would happen if the commander learned a villager had taken shelter inside? Would she be thrown out at once? Or punished? And why had Marcus allowed her to follow him inside at all? Had she seen a hint of pity in his eyes? Or was it simply a soldier's decision to help a desperate stranger? These questions circled her mind until exhaustion finally overcame her. For Marcus, the night was no easier. He turned restlessly on the hard floor, his memories of past campaigns breaking through the stillness. He remembered comrades lost in ambushes, the sound of screams carried through forests far from home. Allowing someone into his quarters had not been his plan. Yet when he saw the fear in the girl's face, he found himself unable to send her back to the streets. He told himself it was temporary, that she would move on once she regained strength, but a part of him already knew he had made a decision that would alter both their lives. By morning, when the sound of horns called the soldiers to drill, both were awake, each silently aware that this uneasy arrangement was only beginning. The next morning began with the sharp sound of horns echoing through the fortress, a signal that sent soldiers pouring into the yard for drill. Livia sat up on the cot, blinking against the dim light seeping in through the narrow slit of a window. She pulled the cloak tighter around her shoulders, uncertain if she was even allowed to remain in the room while Marcus was away. Her first thought was whether other soldiers would notice her presence and what would happen if they did. Would she be forced out? Would Marcus be punished for sheltering her? These questions pressed against her chest, heavier than hunger. Marcus entered briefly, already armored for the day. His movements were efficient, every buckle tightened, every strap checked with practiced hands. He looked at her only once, and though he said nothing, she understood he expected her to stay inside. That silence carried more weight than words. It was both protection and warning. When he left, the room grew still, and Livia listened to the distant shouts of commands as the drills began in the yard. Her unease pushed her to act. She did not want to appear as an idle burden, so she searched the small space for tasks she could do. The floor had tracked dust from her sandals, so she found a scrap of cloth and brushed it clean. The cot's blanket was folded neatly, but she shook it out and arranged it again, careful not to disturb the cloak Marcus had given her. At the table, she poured fresh water from the jug into a cup, a small orderliness that made her feel less like a trespasser. Hours later, Marcus returned, his face damp with sweat, the mark of drills visible in the tense set of his shoulders. He placed a small loaf of bread and dried figs on the table before removing his helmet. Livia rose quickly, unsure if she should sit or wait for his permission. To ease the silence, she whispered, "I cleaned the room." She thought he might ignore her, but he glanced around once, nodded slightly, and sat. His nod was not praise, but it told her he had noticed. As they ate, she dared to ask the question that had pressed in her mind since she entered the fortress. "Will they allow me to stay here?" Her voice trembled, and she hated how desperate she sounded, yet she needed to know. Marcus paused, his eyes narrowing in thought. He chewed slowly before answering with the calm tone of a man used to giving orders. "As long as you keep quiet, no one will interfere." He did not explain further, but she understood. Her safety depended on her silence. That night, when the lamps were lit again, she studied him as he set aside his armor. His body bore scars on the arms and shoulders, marks of past battles that spoke more than any words could. She wondered what he had endured, what he had lost, and why he had chosen not to send her away when it would have been simpler. She wanted to ask his name, but she feared intruding too far. Finally, she whispered, "I am Livia." For a moment, she thought he would remain silent as always, but then he answered plainly, "Marcus." It was a small exchange, yet it broke the barrier of namelessness between them. As sleep drew near, Livia felt a little less like an intruder and more like someone who had been given a place, however fragile it was. She understood that she must tread carefully, but in that quiet room, guarded by the silence of a soldier who had chosen not to abandon her, she felt, for the first time in weeks, that she might survive. The following days passed in a rhythm that was new to Livia. Each morning began with the sound of horns, the clatter of armor, and the echo of commands shouted across the yard. She learned quickly to remain inside when Marcus was gone, but her mind wrestled with unanswered questions. Did the commanders know she was here? Would another soldier discover her and demand she leave? What would happen if Marcus's decision to shelter her was seen as breaking discipline? These thoughts pressed at her every time she heard footsteps outside the door. One afternoon, when Marcus returned from drill, she finally asked the question she had carried in silence. "What if someone finds me here?" Her words were quiet, her eyes fixed on the floor. Marcus removed his helmet, placed it on the table, and looked at her directly for the first time since she asked for shelter. His answer was calm, but firm. "As long as you cause no trouble, no one will question me. The others know better than to interfere with what I do in my own quarters." His confidence eased her fear slightly, though she knew it was a fragile protection, one that depended entirely on his authority among the soldiers. Still, her presence could not remain entirely hidden. Once, when she slipped outside to fetch water from a barrel, two younger legionaries glanced at her curiously. One smirked, but when Marcus appeared, the smirk vanished. He gave them no explanation, and they asked none. Livia realized then that his silence was not only for himself, but also a shield for her. Inside the room, her role slowly shifted. She began to prepare the table before meals, folding his cloak neatly, sweeping the floor more carefully. At first, she did this to avoid seeming idle, but over time it became her way of proving she belonged, even in a small way. Marcus never praised her, but he noticed. Once, when she cut her finger while mending her dress with a needle she had found, he crossed the room without hesitation, took her hand, and wrapped it with a strip torn from his old tunic. His touch was steady, almost impersonal, yet it was the first time she felt a gentleness beneath his stern exterior. That evening, she found herself speaking more than before. She told him of her father, how he had once taken her to the market in the nearby town, how he had laughed when she tried to haggle with a merchant over figs. She admitted how quickly everything had fallen apart after his death, how her stepmother had wasted no time in turning her out. As she spoke, Marcus listened without interrupting, his eyes lowered, his hands resting on the table. When she finished, he said only, "You survived." The words were simple, but they struck her as both recognition and reassurance. The soldiers outside grew louder as the night came on, their voices carrying through the walls with the smell of smoke and wine. Livia felt the weight of the fortress pressing around her. Yet inside this small room, the air was different. The silence no longer frightened her. She began to see it as something they shared, something that allowed her to rest without fear of sudden cruelty. Before sleep, she whispered his name again, testing it on her lips. Marcus. He turned his head slightly, acknowledging her, but said nothing more. That was enough. For the first time since her father's death, she felt that the ground beneath her was steady, even if only for tonight. In the days that followed, Livia's world inside the fortress began to stretch beyond the four walls of Marcus's quarters. At first, she had not dared to step outside except when necessary, but gradually he allowed her to accompany him on short walks along the ramparts. The first time she climbed the stone steps beside him, she felt the eyes of the soldiers below, but none of them spoke. She wondered if they whispered behind their backs, questioning who she was and why Marcus permitted her presence. Yet their silence showed respect, or perhaps caution. Whatever the reason, no one challenged him. From the top of the wall, the land stretched wide. Beyond the fortress lay the village she had once called home, and farther still the hills where raiders sometimes crossed the border. Marcus pointed toward those hills, his voice low but steady. We buried men there. It was not a boast, not a story meant to impress her, but a fact carried with the weight of memory. Livia glanced at his scarred face, realizing how much of his life had been shaped by battles she could never imagine. She thought of asking him why he had chosen the Legion in the first place. Was it poverty, duty, or something else? But she sensed that prying too deeply might close the fragile door of trust that was beginning to open between them. Instead, she asked what had been troubling her since the first night. Why did you let me in? You could have sent me away. Her voice was quiet, but it carried the sharp edge of a woman who had been abandoned before. Marcus did not answer immediately. He kept his eyes on the horizon as if weighing his words. Finally, he said, "Because I saw you had nothing, and I know what that feels like." His tone was flat, but the meaning was clear. Livia lowered her gaze, her throat tightening. She realized she was not the only one carrying loss. Their evenings grew into a routine. After drills and duties, Marcus would return, and they would share bread or stew from the garrison's kitchen. Livia began to ask simple questions about the fortress, about the soldiers, about the rules she should follow to avoid trouble. He explained them patiently, not with long speeches, but with plain answers. Do not wander too far. Do not draw attention. Trust no one except him. She listened carefully, understanding that her safety depended on this knowledge. One night, as they walked the yard after most soldiers had retired, Livia told him more of her past. She admitted her fear of loneliness, how she had begged her stepmother to reconsider, how the cold dismissal had cut deeper than hunger. She said she feared being cast out again, left with no one to protect her. Marcus listened, his expression unreadable, until he finally said, "You are here now. That is enough." The words were not tender, but they anchored her, giving her something solid to hold on to. By then, she began to sense a change in herself. The fear that once clenched her stomach every time a soldier passed had begun to fade. The silence she once dreaded now felt less like emptiness and more like safety. She noticed small details. The way Marcus set her share of food on the table before his own. The way he slowed his steps so she could keep pace along the wall. The way his eyes softened when she whispered his name. These were gestures she never expected but had come to rely on. Still, questions lingered in her mind. How long would this fragile arrangement last? Could she truly belong in a place built for soldiers, not women with no status? And what would happen if word of her presence reached the commander? She held these worries close, but for now, the certainty that Marcus had chosen not to abandon her gave her a sense of strength she had thought lost forever. That night, as they sat side by side on the ramparts under the pale light of the moon, their silence was no longer heavy. It was shared, and in that quiet she realized she no longer felt like an intruder, but like someone who had been given a place to stay, not only in his quarters, but in his guarded life. The days turned into weeks. and Livia's presence inside the fortress no longer felt like a secret stolen in fear, but like a rhythm both she and Marcus had come to accept. Yet she still carried unanswered questions that gnawed at her when the nights grew long. Was she truly safe here? Would the commander ever challenge Marcus for allowing her to stay? And what place could she, a discarded villager, have in a world ruled by discipline and command? The answer came sooner than she expected. One morning, as Marcus prepared for inspection, a centurion passed their quarters and caught sight of her standing in the doorway. Livia froze, her hands gripping the frame as her heart pounded. The centurion's eyes narrowed, and he asked sharply, "Who is this?" Marcus did not flinch. He stepped forward, his voice steady and clipped. "She tends to my quarters. She causes no trouble." For a moment, silence hung between them, and Livia feared she would be dragged out. But the centurion, knowing Marcus's years of service and reputation, said nothing more. He gave a dismissive grunt and walked on. Only then did she release the breath she had been holding. That moment settled one of her deepest fears. The fortress did not question Marcus's choices. His silence and authority shielded her more than she had realized. After the inspection, Marcus found her still shaken. She whispered, "They could have sent me away." He looked at her, his expression unchanged, but his words carried finality. "I would not have allowed it." That answer, simple and firm, eased a burden she had carried since the day she begged for his shelter. From then on, she no longer moved with the same hesitation. She began to step outside more often, helping quietly where she could, fetching water, mending worn cloth, preparing simple meals. Some soldiers looked at her curiously, but none dared speak against her. Marcus's silent approval was enough to secure her place. In the evenings, their walks on the ramparts became longer. Livia found herself asking the questions she had once held back. "Do you regret it?" she asked him one night, her voice cautious. "Letting me stay?" Marcus's answer was short, but there was no doubt in his tone. "No," he paused, then added, "You belong here now." Those words stayed with her, giving her the certainty she had longed for since her father's death. The bond between them deepened in ways neither of them named aloud. Livia no longer felt like a guest or a burden. She felt a quiet partnership forming in the way they shared food, in the way she looked for his return each evening, and in the way his presence beside her silenced the constant fear that had once ruled her life. On a warm afternoon, Marcus came back from the training yard, his armor set aside, his face calmer than she had ever seen it. He placed both hands on the table and said plainly, "You do not need to fear being cast out again. This is your home now. Stay with me." His voice carried no hesitation, no condition, only certainty. Livia's eyes filled with tears, not of sorrow, but of release. She nodded, her words breaking softly, "I will." That night, as the fortress quieted and the sounds of soldiers faded into the distance, they sat together in the small room that no longer felt cold or temporary. For the first time since her father's death, Livia felt she had a place where she belonged, and for the first time in years, Marcus allowed someone into the silence he had guarded so closely. The story that began with fear and desperation ended in a simple truth. Two people, scarred by loss, had chosen not to abandon one another. And in that choice, both found a family they thought they had lost forever.